Welcome back, everyone. We are back with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who is our own director of, I thought I knew it off by heart, high school programs and some
programs.
Sorry?
And a faculty member.
Yes. Thank you.
I changed my title in September. It's fine.
Yes. And we are discussing feeding babies in the Talmud and up till today. Yeah. And I'm really excited for the second of 4 sessions that we're going to be doing on this topic. And Rabbanit Sarna, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I know this week, like post Thanksgiving, is really hard. I'm definitely feeling that also. But shockingly, babies still need to eat, so we're still talking about it. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about almost like the economics of feeding babies. And the reason why I think that's really important is that we sometimes the conversation around breast milk when there was a formula crisis earlier this year was like, oh, just breastfeed, it's free. And I feel like that's so often, that's such a often heard kind of idea in our culture that breastfeeding is free, so much so that you have these like canned responses to it, like it's only free if you think women's time is free, things like that. And you have people even who kind of like count, like, here's how much I normally get paid, here's how many hours I spent breastfeeding, like that is a full-time job. You can pay me whatever it is, $100,000 a year, $60,000 a year, whatever it is you get paid to breastfeed, and like, perfect, then I'm in. Otherwise, like, it's not free. And I think that that's something we commonly say in America, and Jewish sources actually just like really address it kind of head on. It's like the primary discussions about breastfeeding in the Talmud are these economic discussions, and where you see it really like hitting the fan is in cases of divorce. So we'll be looking at some of that. But even, Jewish marriages, the Talmud and Ketubot talks kind of very explicitly about the economics of a Jewish home, who's responsible for which pieces of home functionality, who's responsible for what kinds of income, and if one person lets the other person down in terms of that income, like what are they supposed to do about it and where do they go? And we'll hopefully, maybe we'll see the Rambam today literally talking about how you can like sue your husband to feed your baby, which is just kind of like an amazing idea of a wife taking a husband to court over like his insufficient involvement or support of her feeding their baby. So when we're talking about, and remember that the text we're looking at, we're going to look at one non-legal text today finally. Well, I guess last week we saw some midrashim and stuff also. Most of the texts we'll be looking at today are legal, but whenever we look at legal texts, we have to imagine the lives that are being lived like under and above and around those texts, such that there needed to be law about this. And I think, that's what to me is very animating about it. And then also the way the law itself, the way the Mishnah itself that we'll look at in one second, the way the Mishnah itself is written is also just like so interesting and illuminative of the way that we think about, or we being the way the Torah and Judaism and the Jewish tradition thinks about like what breastfeeding is, how expensive it is, and things like that. So I will just mention that the source sheet we're going to be using, so I sent it to Kayla earlier today. I was like, this is all done, I'm ready to rock. And then I had a whole bunch of meetings, and in between all the meetings, I like tinkered with my source sheet a little bit more. So I kept the original numbering, but I added in a whole source that's now numbered 3.5 and a few little like sub sourcelach. So if you printed it out, amazing for you. Most of it's still right, but if you were like, what are we talking about? Then definitely, look up at the screen, because I'll be screen sharing a new source sheet, and we can also put, thanks, Chaya. So we put a Google Doc to the updated source sheet into the chat. Okay, but let's get going here. Okay, so whose job is it anyways? That's what we're talking about today. So I want to start out with this very classic Mishnah about kind of the divisions of home labor, but this one specifically is about like what a wife is supposed to bring into a marriage, or what she's supposed to do in her marriage. So here we go. These are the tasks that a wife performs for her husband. She grinds wheat, and she bakes, she does the laundry, she cooks, she nurses their babies, she makes the bed, and she like and does stuff with wool. But then she can kind of like purchase her way out of that. So if she brings into the marriage one maidservant, then she doesn't have to grind flour, and she doesn't have to bake, and she doesn't have to do laundry. So that's one maidservant's worth of work. And then she's left with the rest of the list. So she brings in one maidservant. She doesn't do those first 3 items on the list, but she still does cooking, nursing, making the bed, and wool. If she brings in a second one, then that knocks out the next 2 items on the list, which are mevashelet umenika. So she doesn't have to cook, and she doesn't have to feed the baby. And I actually love those 2 things going together, because like one nursemaid, her entire job then is just going to be nutrition. Like some things I cook with my body, with the inside of my body, and some things I cook on the outside of my body, and like I am the nutrition for this family, which I just think is just so great. Because I think we often, if I said to you like, yeah, like nursing and cooking are the same, there might be even like a little vomit reaction inside of your like mouth. Like we don't think about nursing as like making food for our family. But that's kind of exactly what it is, right? And the Mishnah is just like full on with it. So the Mishnah just lists together, yeah, like this one nursemaid, her entire job is or maidservant. She's just a cook and a nursemaid. She's that's what maid number 2 does, and maid number 3 does all the stuff with fabrics. So maid number 3 makes the bed, and she spins she spins wool. And if she brings in a 4th maidservant, then she really doesn't have to do anything, and she just sits in her cathedra. She sits in her chair, and the maids do everything. And but then Rabbi Eliezer says, wait, hold on. Even if she brings in 100 maidservants, she still has to spin, because if she's not spinning, she's really not doing anything, and that leads to licentiousness. You wouldn't want women having too much time on their hands. Says Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, that someone who makes a vow that his wife is not allowed to do any work, that's actually a violation of their like marriage contract, and she's allowed to divorce. He has to divorce her and again pay off her ketubah, because if she's bored, that's really bad. Like it leads to idiocy. And so him forcing her not to do anything is also a type of abuse, actually. And there, I just love teaching this, because we could have stopped after the second maidservant, but here we're seeing the Mishnah really like take a stand against coercive control, which is a type of domestic abuse, and one that I think, like we don't necessarily talk about enough. We don't prepare kalas for, but a husband who says like, you are not allowed to do anything, sit here, do nothing. You might think, wow, she's Yoshevet Bekatedra, like a queen, right? But actually, if it's coming from her husband forcing her, that's grounds for divorce, because that's coercive control. And you see it right here in the Mishnah, which I just think is so great. So just throwing that in as an aside, that don't exercise coercive control against your spouses. Okay, moving on. So anyways, the point here being, right, this idea that there's all sorts of things that need to get done in our house. We need to have a bed to sleep on. We need to have food to eat. That food requires a lot of steps, from grinding to baking. Our clothes need to be washed. Cooking needs to happen. Feeding the babies needs to happen. It's just one chore of many chores all that participate in the economics of our home. And if you are wealthy enough, the same way with all the other pieces of your home economy, you can offload them to other people. And so breastfeeding is just like one of many. And, the interesting thing here is like, there seems like a big thing missing, right? Like we think nowadays, like, wow, but what about that like special mother-child bond that comes through breastfeeding, and like no amount of money can replace that, or that special like relationship where your body produces these like really cool antibodies that keeps your baby healthy, and like that can only happen from you or whatever. So like, yeah, on the one hand, breast milk is really cool, and on the other hand, like, nope, we just need babies to live until adulthood, and that's expensive, and it's one expense of many in our household, and breastfeeding is just a chore that helps us to achieve that goal. So here it's kind of there's no sense of like, wow, this special thing that like, wow, aren't women so lucky they get to do it? Like, no, and in fact, you can buy yourself out of it. Which I think, again, I know I mentioned this last week, that when we were talking about like, has it always been this hard? And the answer was like, yes, absolutely, it's always been this hard, and it's always been this expensive. And here you see like, what is it an equivalent expense to? Like hiring a private chef, like that's what it's an equivalent expense to. When you think about it just from like an economic perspective, but a piece of the home economy that maybe only mom can kind of uniquely contribute. But again, remember that in the times of the Mishnah, it's not, I mean, there's a lot, like the world is an essentialist kind of place. And so like, similarly, there's like, these are the female rules and like, these are the male rules. And I know like sometimes people read this list, they're like, wow, like I don't do any of those things in my home. That's totally reasonable. Like you have managed to buy yourself out of those things. But if nobody cooked for, like if you couldn't afford to eat takeout or prepared foods, and nobody cooked for you, and nobody did your laundry, like you would feel that real fast, so like the fact that you don't do your laundry and you don't cook, like that's because you managed to like rearrange your home economy as such. Okay, anyways, this is a super interesting Mishnah. It also like has a side thing, and the Gemara here goes into it, and Judith Hauptman has some really interesting writing about the relationship between this Mishnah and like Harchakot and Hilchot Nida, and like what are the pieces of household labor that are like labor, and what are the pieces of household labor that are like special relationship. And so right, so like making a bed, for example, right, matzah lo hamita, this one here, like, oh, that's work on the one hand, but it's also special relationship. And so in Hilchot Nida, for example, a woman can't make the bed in front of her husband while she's Nida, but like she can still make the bed. He just like can't be in the room. It can't be like a turn down. And so that makes you wonder whether the nursing piece here is in some way similar. Like, yeah, just like making the bed, it's part of this home economy, but also it could be part of this special relationship, right? So that's the other way to read it. Like, oh, minikat benas, it's right in between. Okay, cooking, thing that has to happen, and like making the bed. And so which one is it kind of more similar to? That's the other kind of question to raise about this Mishnah. But anyways, this Mishnah becomes the jumping off point for the Gemara's kind of like primary treatment of nursing. We saw some of this last time, all of those, like we looked at like Hilchot wet nurse last week, so that stuff was also here. So here we'll take it from the start, and this first Gemara gets to the question of whose job is it to breastfeed? So you might say like it's the job of the person with the breasts. Like, yeah, cool, it's mom's job, but it's not actually so obvious that that's the case, because could really be the case that dad is ultimately responsible for the feeding of the children, in which case like mom is just like a vessel through which that happens, but really it's dad's responsibility. So here's where the Gemara likes to put things to the test. So here's where the Gemara puts it to the test. Lema, this is about our Mishnah. Lema manitin lo k'beit Shammai. Let's say that this Mishnah that we just looked at is not in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai. So how do we know? We're going to bring two Breitas. The second one is a lot more convincing than the first one, but the first one is a lot more interesting than the second one. So we'll start with the first one. Titania says in a Breita, Nadra shelo lahanik et bena, a woman who makes a vow not to nurse her child, which, by the way, like when nursing is hard and you get angry about it, and it's so easy to be like, oh, no, God, right? But then, like, okay, did you just make a vow not to nurse your child? And like, is that vow binding? Like, it's a very relatable circumstance, I feel, particularly like if you're struggling to latch or your baby is like on a strike or something like that, like, I feel that kind of vow is like probably happens all the time. And so, like, is it binding? Asks the Braita. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai say, yes. Shometa dad mipiv. You make that vow, you have to take your nibble out of his mouth and not nurse him because you just made a binding vow. And Beit Hillel Omrim, Kofa Umenika. So Beit Hillel say, doesn't matter what you want, your husband can compel you to nurse and can compel her to nurse, and she has to nurse the child even against her will, which is like also really complicated. The husband like basically like forcing the wife to do it. So it seems clear that Beit Shammai say, yes, like she can make this vow. And then Beit Hillel say, well, maybe she can make the vow. It would be, so right, how you read Beit Hillel is really interesting. Is it that she made the vow? It's binding on her, and then her husband is literally like using her body, like basically like forcing her. So she's not doing it, he's doing it. Like she just becomes this like object in this relationship, which again I think is also like super relatable. This idea that like mom just gets like objectified through the process of breastfeeding. And this even more so, this language of kofa umenikato, he forces her to nurse the baby against her will, or does that reflect something about like the neder not taking effect because she maybe has this greater obligation to nurse the child? In which case, what Beit Shammai are saying is, yes, the neder takes effect because she doesn't actually have any obligation to feed the child, and Beit Hillel say, no, she actually has this higher obligation to feed the child, and she can't take a neder that would get in the way of that obligation. It's kind of so there's like a few different ways to read this machloket, but Rashi reads it that second way, that the neder can't really be effectuated according to Beit Hillel because she has this prior obligation to feed the child, and she can't just like make a neder and get out of it. Whereas Beit Shammai say, no, she doesn't have an obligation to feed the baby. She can do whatever she wants. And that's what we'll see in the second Breita in a moment. But before we get there, we have this next phrase of the Breita. Garsha, if she gets divorced, Eina kufa, if they're divorced, then he cannot force her to feed the child. And in that case, he carries on the responsibility towards feeding the baby. And we'll see that right now. If the baby recognizes the mother, and we're going to go into that in the next source, if he recognizes the mother, then the divorced dad, ex-husband, has to pays mom to feed the baby, and he forces her to feed the baby. And he compels her to nurse the baby because there's this danger, there's a danger that if mom, whom the baby recognizes, won't feed the baby will die. So that's the situation in which you can force to feed the baby. So it seems like here, from this case of Nit Garsha, from the case of the divorced parents, dad carries the responsibility. Mom is the vessel, but maybe not like a necessary vessel unless the baby recognizes her. And once the baby recognizes her, then dad can force mom because it's dad's responsibility to like not let the baby die, or like mom, or you could say that. So that's one way to say it's still dad. Another way to say is that actually at a certain point, once the baby recognizes mom, actually the baby is in charge. And this is also really interesting. There's such a thing today as like the baby-led weaning. So often when people use the terminology baby-led weaning, what they mean is that instead of like taking baby food and like pushing it into the baby's mouth on a spoon, you kind of leave food out for the baby to pick up themselves and put into their own mouth. That's often what people mean by baby-led weaning, but there's like an extremist version of baby-led weaning, which is to say that like the baby is entirely in charge of its own nutrition, so much so that like if the baby wants to keep nursing indefinitely till whatever age, that's the baby's prerogative because nursing is the baby's choice. So far we've seen, right? Maybe it's mom's job, that's Beit Hillel. Maybe it's dad. Maybe everyone agrees that it's dad in a case of divorce. Beit Shammai, I think it's dad 100% of the time, up to and including the idea that mom could just say, I'm not nursing anymore, and literally like take herself out of the equation. But then there's this other idea that once baby recognizes mom, like kind of the baby's desires are what start to override. And yeah, like dad has to settle the bills. So like dad, mom has to do it, but dad has to pay. But really the baby's kind of the one calling the shots at a certain point. And that's maybe another idea of kind of like who pays for this, or like who is responsible, or who gets to make decisions. That definitely seems to sort of play out strongly here. And we'll see it even more so when we go into that in depth in another source, but I just want to round this out with the second breita here. So v'od Tanya Beit Shammai omrim eina menika. Beit Shammai say, it's on a breita that Beit Shammai says that women do not need to nurse, right? So in Rashi really says that out. Gabe kol hanashim afilu below nadar, right? You can get out of any obligation to nurse. There is no obligation to nurse. Eina menika in general. Just not something moms have to do. And then the stam of the Gemara here says, and I cut out a bunch of the stam. The stam is very confusing, by the way, in between these baraitot, because it really like takes it all over the place. So just so that you know that you're like not getting a full picture here of like where the Gemara goes, I like pared it down to the baraitas in most of the places, but I left in a little stam at the end. Oh, machvarta madnitin dila Beit Shammai. So it's clear the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai, because the Mishnah says, right, these are the Mishnah says it's as not optional as making food, which is, also a pretty relatable idea that like, just like you're part of a home ecosystem or a home economy, and like you have to contribute in certain ways. You have to make food, you have to feed the baby, you have to all sorts of things. In Beit Shammai, I mean, we don't know what Beit Shammai think about like women's obligations to I don't know, cook in the house, but it seems like Beit Shammai, if Beit Shammai had written the Mishnah, Beit Shammai would have just taken menika et bana out of the list, which is super, super interesting that we have this ancient position that says, yep, women don't have to nurse. Nope, can't force her. She doesn't even need to make an neder. It's just not part of her job. Right. And on the other hand, we saw last week, we saw Hannah saying to God, right? And there'll be more Hannah later today. We think of Hannah as like this prayer figure, but in a way she's also like a interesting kind of breastfeeding figure. So we have Hannah saying to God, like, why did you even give me breasts if you're not going to give me the opportunity to use them? And here we have Beit Shammai saying, yeah, like women don't have to do it, which is just like really kind of like an astounding and interesting position, I think, altogether. Okay. So now let's go back to that. At what point does the baby start calling the shots? So, right, we saw that in a case of divorce, dad can't force mom to continue breastfeeding if she doesn't want to. But if the baby recognizes mom, then mom does have to keep breastfeeding, and dad has to pay mom, which is really interesting because also, by the way, you're forcing dad to pay mom, right? Like, what if mom is really expensive or like dad wants nothing more to do with her and yet the halacha is like, nope, she gets to keep breastfeeding and she has to be paid for that. So it might really, like, at first glance it seems like, wow, poor mom. But I think it's also a little bit like poor dad too. And it's very, like many people, when they're getting divorced, if it's not amicable, you don't want to then like still be like passing whatever. You don't want to then be like, I'm paying you for this, which always ends up happening, obviously, once there's children in the case of a divorce, but you don't get to just like leave in this case or like have any kind of separation. Even if dad might want to, right? Like dad might also really want to like, I'm going to pay someone else, like I'm done with you. And he's not allowed to do that either. And we'll see, actually, the Gemara is going to really recognize how like sad and hard those situations are in this Gemara. So buckle in. Okay, so the Gemara is going to ask, at what age does a baby recognize that it's a baby recognize its mother? So Ad Kama, Amar Rava, Amar Rabbi, Amar Abba, Amar Rav. So Rav says, and all these people are just quoting Rav, 3 months. So Shmuel Amar Shloshim Yom. Shmuel says 30 days. But the difference between a baby at 30 days and 3 months is extraordinary, by the way. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Rabbi Yochanan Chamishim Yom. So Rabbi Yochanan says 50 days. Amar Rav Shimi bar Abaye Halacha Ke Rabbi Yitzchak She'amar Mishum Rabbi Yochanan. So then we have this later statement that says the halacha is 50 days. And so then the Gemara is going to say, Bishlama Rav Rabbi Yochanan. So that's the 3 months and 50 days opinions. So we can make sense of both of those disputes. Kol chad v'chad ki chorvei. And you could say, okay, 50 days, 3 months. Maybe each baby kind of varies according to its like intelligence, like it's harifut, right? That's chorfei. It's like how sharp it is. Like some babies, they just like get smarter quicker or something like that. That's how the Gemara is trying to make sense of this. But Shmuel, ki hagavna mimashkachala. Who has ever heard of a baby, that 1-month-old baby that's like that smart that it recognizes its mother? And so then we have an answer, a great answer. Ki ata Rami bar Yechezkel amar lo tetzitinu lahane klale dechel Yehuda achi mishmei de Shmuel. So Rami bar Yechezkel says, don't listen to the principles that my brother Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, which is so interesting because like we didn't have anyone like saying that in the name of Shmuel. So there's like maybe like a manuscript issue here or something, a little unclear. But he says, rather, this is what Shmuel said. Shmuel just said, yeah, whenever the baby recognizes mom, that's when you can't, that's when dad has to pay mom to breastfeed in the case of divorce. So now we have a case, right? And now is where the Gemara through this Agadata is going to really show us like how hard these cases are. And I just want to like warn you that this case and the story that's told and the rabbi's actions in the case are like really pretty insensitive, and I am not super interested in like defending them. Like I think in some ways maybe like it's coming to show the harshness of this halacha, the difficultness of it, and the difficulty of a situation where a couple are getting divorced with a baby who's still breastfeeding, and how hard and sad that is. But also like, what does it mean when a mom doesn't want to breastfeed her baby anymore? Like, does the baby to her represent a husband who she was trying to get rid of? Does it is she like super depressed? Like, oh, you're just like, what's happening here, right? And the Gemara tells us these complex stories like for us to kind of analyze them and see the law through the stories. So that's what I think is happening here. So Ahida Atayla Kame de Shmuel. So a divorcee came before Shmuel. Amar Leila Rav Dimi Bar Yosef. So Shmuel said to Rav Dimi Bar Yosef, Zil Bidka, go and check her, see whether the child recognizes the mother. Azal Otva Bidare Dinashe. And he then put together this like row of women. Vishakle Livra Ukama Hadarla Alayhu. And he took the baby and he passed the baby like down the row of women. Ki Metale Gaba, when the baby got to this woman, to mom, Have Kamasve La'apa, and he looked at her face, Kivishtaini La'ena Mina, and he was really like happy, and then she turned her eyes away from him. Amarla, and the rabbi, whose name is Dimi Bar Yosef, right? Dimi Bar Yosef says to this woman, Netof Einech Kum Dare Brech. He says, lift up your eyes, get up, Kum Dare Brech, take your son. So what happens is he makes this whole test, lines up the woman with mom at the end, and passes the baby from woman to woman. The baby gets to mom, clearly recognizes mom, the baby's face lights up, and mom can't even look at her baby. It's just such a sad story. It's just such a sad image of this mother who is just so removed or sad or scared or depressed or a million things, right? It's not totally clear what's going on with mom. It's left up to us to kind of imagine or understand for ourselves what's going on with her. And then the rabbi's response, you could read it in two ways, right? One is like, come on, get on with it. Like, your baby recognizes you, moving right along. Like, just pick yourself up and dust yourself off and get over it. Or you could read it in this like very gentle way, like giving her chizuk, giving her support, wipe off your eyes, like dry your tears, and your baby needs you. And so, the way you read it is going to tell you whether this is like, in any event, I think this mother is very sad figure. And the way you read the rabbi's kind of response to it maybe says more about you. I don't know. But there's definitely like a gentle read of it and a not gentle read of it. And the not gentle read of it maybe would show us like, wow, these halachot are really hard and are hard to implement. These cases are really hard. And the gentle read would show like, these people need support and they need to be seen. And not only did the rabbi say, okay, he sees you, he like noticed how she was looking and he commented on it in a way that maybe helped her feel like, yeah, someone cares that I'm this sad. I don't know. There's like a lot. You could read this in so many different ways. Every time I read it, I'm like, oh, I don't know. Maybe it's like this. Maybe it's like that. So anyways, I think there's one last piece that's kind of interesting, right? Because that was all about eyes. That whole case, that whole story was all about right? He looks at her, she looks at him. And so then the Gemara says the obvious question of like, well, what about a baby that's blind? Suma minayada. How does the blind baby know how mom, who his mother is? And Rav Ashi says baricho v'tama, through smell and through taste. And by the way, like most babies start out quite blind. All babies start out quite blind. Like eyesight really develops over those first bunch of months. And babies certainly kind of recognize their mom before they have more developed eyesight. That's why you always like put your baby really close to your face. It's like people do that naturally. Like no one teaches you like get really close all up in your baby's face, but that's like why we have that instinct. It's a very bad instinct in times of communicable diseases. Okay, so the question is, right, who gets to decide or like who pays for it? So in this case, again, it really gets into this baby that once the baby recognizes mom, in a way the baby is calling the shots. And we'll see that even more when we get to, we're going to look today at sources about weaning. But it's not only the baby that calls the shots, it's complicated because there are cases where mom and dad call the shots. So that's what we looked at this last week. This is the case of the couple who disagree about whether to hire a wet nurse. So she says she wants to nurse. He says, I want to hire you a wet nurse. We listen to her because Tzara Didahu, it's her suffering. So what does it mean that it's her suffering? So Rashi, this is not the only place where Rashi seems to be like very sympathetic to mastitis. There's like a few cases where Rashi is actually. So Rashi reads it that way. Rashi reads it as like her breast will be engorged and it will hurt her. The Rambam says I want to be close to her. I brought the Shita Mikubetzet that brings a bunch of them all together, but Tsar Hulali Frosh Mibana, it's hard for her to be separated from her baby, and some other woman's gonna have this like closeness to my baby. What a terrible thing. I don't want that. That's the Tsar. And the Rimigash is like really interesting. The Rimigash says like it's her suffering, so she gets to decide. Like my ihu b'tzara dida hilkach la shomim. So that's like really interesting and a little bit like harsh language for like, oh, like why should he care about her suffering? But I think it kind of means like, yeah, like it's her business. Like she should decide. It's her body. So it comes off a little harsh, but I think there's like a lot of wisdom there of like her body, her choice kind of thing, which obviously I'm kind of quite sympathetic to. But anyways, we kind of walked through this last time. But I wanted to come back to this with the Shita Mikubetzet and just like focus for a second on like, well, there's a lot to say that actually maybe like dad is in charge or like dad has to pay for it. But at the same time, this recognition that like at the end of the day, it's her body. So like maybe she should like have some decision-making power here. So she certainly has decision-making power if she wants to breastfeed, including in cases of divorce. But the question is, if she doesn't want to breastfeed, well, so far we've seen she doesn't want to breastfeed, but the baby recognizes her, then maybe she doesn't have a choice because otherwise the baby will die. And so we have these or we have cases where maybe if they can't actually afford to have anyone else breastfeed, then certainly Beit Hillel would say then she has to breastfeed. But that's not totally obvious, because if she grew up from, so it seems like that from the Mishnah, but then the end of this Gemara is if she doesn't want to breastfeed and he wants her to, or like she comes from wealth, so she came into this assuming she would not breastfeed and that there would be a wet nurse, and he says no, like there's no wet nurse, like you're doing this. The Gemara says no, like her status can only rise through marriage. It cannot go down through marriage. It can only go up through if her husband is of higher status, but it can't go down if her husband is of lower status. And Rabbi Elazar, the reason for the naming of Chava, the naming for woman, is that she is the mother of all living. She's giving to her husband to live with him, but not to suffer with him. So it sort of seems like, actually, even though it almost seemed like Beit Hillel wanted us to think like, yeah, it's just her job, like breastfeeding is just her job, like all these other household labors, you can make it like an economic calculation, but at the end of the day, if she doesn't bring in 2 maids, then she's got to do it. Here it seems like, no, maybe Rav Huna and Rabbi Elazar are saying maybe she doesn't have to breastfeed, even if he can't afford it. It's not so surprising for Rabbi Elazar to say that because maybe he holds like Beit Shammai, but Rav Huna certainly is not holding by Beit Shammai. And Rav Huna still says, nope, like she goes up with him and doesn't come down with him. So that, right, Beit Shammai saying she doesn't actually have an obligation to breastfeed. But Rav Huna seems to be like in the Beit Hillel world of like, yes, there is an obligation. Yes, maybe even if she makes a vow to not breastfeed, the husband can maybe even force her to do it. Rav Huna says, if she wants to have a wet nurse and she comes from a world where that's like something that is done and afforded, then that's what she should have. So that's just kind of like really interesting in terms of like the whole economics of the question. And I think if you're saying, okay, so who decides? Like, how do you practically, like, are they breastfeeding or are they not breastfeeding? I think so far we like really don't have a clear answer to that. I think there are cases where mom gets to decide, cases where dad has to pay for it, and cases where the baby seems to be the one deciding in this little triad relationship. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at in the last 15 minutes is I want to look at some sources about weaning. And in some ways, the most intense description of weaning that we have in Tanakh is Hannah. We have a description, and we'll talk about Sarah next week. So Abraham throws Yitzchak a party when Yitzchak is weaned, but there's actually in the Torah there's no description of Sarah in that party. I like to say like, yeah, like weaning causes depression often, and like maybe she's just like not even there, she's like off in the corner crying by herself because weaning is so hard. But anyways, like she doesn't appear in the text, whereas Hannah does. So Hannah, she davens, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, whatever. Hannah davens. She has her baby, right? And then part of the whole story in the beginning of the book of Shmuel is that Elkanah goes very often to bring these sacrifices. He goes annually. The Hannah lo alta, but for the first time, Hannah doesn't go with him. So Hannah says, once he is weaned, then I'll bring him up. We will appear before God, and then he will stay there forever. Elkanah says, do what you think is right, stay here until you have weaned him. There's a ton of commentary about what this phrase is. Yakum Hashem et divaro. May the Lord fulfill his word. You can see this like classic JPS like notation of like, no, what is happening here? Those footnotes, by the way, if you look it up in the JPS from the like new JPS from the 80s, there's like some fragments that they really get into like good Apikorsisha stuff. There's like some fragments of Shmuel that maybe have a slightly different like words there or something, whatever. Anyways, but all the classical commentators also have just lots and lots of ink spilled on like what that means. But Hannah, right, she doesn't want to go on this long trip with her baby. She just wants to stay home, right? But Teshem Haisha, she just sits at home by herself and she feeds her baby until Ad Gomla. Teshem Haisha Matinak Edbana Ad Gomla. Sits at home, she breastfeeds her baby until he is weaned, right? She even has maternity leave from Aliyah Regal. She just stays at home. And then once she has weaned him, by the way, I should mention the Gemara in Chagiga goes into this because there's a lot to say that maybe if she's nursing for 2 years, which is, we'll see that that's kind of the assumption of all the commentators. So here, like the Radak says, ad tashlumi nikatov hu esrim v'arba chodesh hatinok yonik. And then, actually he quotes it, right? V'afal pi shehayu chayvim lavio mishum yira'eh kol zechorcha amar rabotinu ki ratachana benar shaya me'unag v'chalush v'chashasha shema yechala mipnei hadarach. She was worried, right? It seems like actually male babies, maybe they should have gone up on Aliyah Regal. They should have gone up to bring these yearly sacrifices with Elkanah. The baby maybe should have gone. It seems like Elkanah kind of wanted the baby to go, and Hannah had to intervene and say, like, no, he's staying with me. And so the Gemara there understands that to mean that Shmuel actually wasn't a super healthy baby, and she just wanted to like keep him home and protect him. So you can read it that way, that he wasn't a super healthy baby. You can read it a different way, where Hannah's saying, once I bring him to the Mikdash or to the Mishkan at that point, like that's where he's staying. So I'm just waiting and savoring every last like piece of this like special time that we have together. And then I'll bring him up, and there he'll remain. Anyways, so then they go up and they bring all of these sacrifices, and there's Vahanar Nar, which there's also a lot, like the boy was a boy. And there's also a lot of commentary about this, which I really love. I didn't bring it for you, but it's sort of like you sort of have the sense from Hannah of like, he's still a little boy. Like he weaned, but he's still little. But I have to bring him because I promised that I would bring him. And then she kind of goes and delivers him to the Mishkan. I just think it's like such a this sense of like breastfeeding as protective, breastfeeding as this is our time together, and I'm just gonna sit here and I'm just gonna do this, right? That's just like so what it is. Like I'm sitting here with you. I can't do anything other than sitting here with you. There's just something so very relatable about that description. So then, right, we saw the Radak assume that it's 24 months, that 2 years, which by the way, like the breastfeeding norms in America were just changed this year. It used to be 12 months. Now it's like even beyond that, even up to 2 years, which is exactly kind of what the Gemara imagine. So Rabbanan unique tinok v'holich ad 24 chodesh, and then so a child can continue to nurse until the age of 24 months. And then mikan ve'ilach kiyunik sheket, and from there on, it's like someone who nurses from a non-kosher animal. The milk becomes non-kosher to the baby at that point. This language of yonik sheket is like really interesting, because I think a lot of people have this idea of like, if you imagine like someone who's not a baby like nursing, there's like a revulsion reaction to that I think like yonik sheket really like brings out. And that it's like it's cute, stop. And I think that Gemara really like shares that, but one of the things that's interesting is that one of the reasons why the American Academy of Pediatrics like changed the guidelines about breastfeeding babies from 12 to 24 months was not to, they claim, not to like pressure moms to keep breastfeeding if they don't want to, but because moms who do want to breastfeed for more than a year often see a lot of stigma, that there's a lot of like, oh, that's gross, that they experience. And these doctors felt that stigma is wrong. And so they changed the medical guidelines to try and combat it, which is really interesting, because like the Gemara really doesn't have that. It has the sense of like, yes, there is such a thing as like too long, but like 24 months is not, like up to 24 months, that's not too long. And in fact, that's only one opinion. So Rabbi Yehoshua says, afilu arba v'chamesh shanim. Rabbi Yehoshua says, yeah, 4 or 5 years, whatever, all good. But here's lachar shlima arba chodesh v'chozer keyonek sheket. But if a baby stops and then goes back, that's when maybe it becomes like, time's up, like you left, you should stop. Okay. Enough of that for now. Okay, so now it goes back to I cut out some more here, and now, right, how long do you have to be like after 24 months if a baby stops nursing, goes on strike, whatever? And then I guess now we're talking about a toddler, and now a toddler wants to start nursing again. How long is Pirish for? How long is the separation? So like, how long does it take to wean? So Rabbi Yehuda Bar Chaviva says in the name of Shmuel, Shlosha Yamim. Ikdam Rei Tane Rabbi Yehuda Bar Chaviva Kamei Shmuel, Shlosha Yamim. So, okay, so basically, but a bunch of different people all say, some say it's either it's a Breita that was taught before Shmuel, or some say Shmuel taught. So that's just a distinction in like the lineage of the teaching. That it's 3 days. So 3 days is all it takes for a toddler to be like officially done breastfeeding, and then it's over. So again, though, what you're seeing here is not mom separated baby and said you're done. Or separated the toddler and said you're done. It's again, at a certain point, the baby kind of becomes in charge. The toddler becomes in charge, so much so that it's up to the toddler even to stop. It's up to the toddler to say, I'm done now. And then if the toddler wants to go back, no, the toddler's actions are binding, right? Like, we don't think about like babies kind of, or toddlers effectuating anything, right? Like, they're not obligated in mitzvot. Like, they don't have to like, I don't know, like they don't have to like do anything. And here all of a sudden you have this toddler who stops breastfeeding, and that then is like, okay, now you're done. You cannot go back to it. It's over, which is really sort of interesting. Okay. I think I want to skip source 8. I'm just looking at this. And well, source 8, I'll just say it outside for a second. What it's about is like, we have this idea that there's this rule, we talked about it last time, that a nursing woman whose husband died cannot remarry for 24 months. So she cannot marry during that time that her baby is presumed to be breastfeeding. And we saw why that is, that she'll wean the baby, they won't get enough nutrition, then they'll die or something like that. The new husband won't adequately support it. She could not purposely wean the baby, but she could get pregnant, and then the pregnancy will end her ability to lactate. So that's all what's happening here. And there's some interesting stuff about like how much pregnancy ends a breastfeeding journey. And we know that's not actually true for everyone. It kind of depends on how much nutrition mom is taken in and has access to and all that. But anyways, so that's what's happening here. But I think it really does kind of like, it raises the stakes on the weaning conversation, because a minute ago we were saying, oh, well, weaning seems to be in a certain way up to the baby. And here we're saying it's not even exactly up to the baby. It's sort of like 24 months, she's just considered a woman who is nursing, whether she's nursing or not. The halachic ramifications are that she cannot remarry, which, by the way, might be a really big deal, because she's not like she can own property or anything like that, right? So like, she might be like really poor, unprotected in the world, all of that. And yet, because she's been 24 months since she birthed the baby, she cannot get remarried. And it's sort of like, it sort of doesn't matter whether she stopped breastfeeding or not within that amount of time. And that's just the amount of time. And the way that, by the way, like gets carried out, there are halachic opinions that say that women within 24 months of giving birth are categorically breastfeeding, even if they're not breastfeeding, and therefore exempt from minor fast days for 24 months, which is kind of just like an amazing opinion. Like, you gave birth to a baby within the last 24 months, you're a meineket, whether you are lactating or not. And here's your halachic status. You cannot remarry. You don't have to fast minor fast days, which is just kind of really, really interesting. But it just shows you like kind of, yeah, maybe it's up to the baby, but maybe it's actually just like not actually up to the baby. Maybe it's just, this is the category of time, nurse, don't nurse, whatever. But this is just 24 months of postpartum. This is the time that you're in, and no one's actually like in charge. And in fact, it often feels that way. Who's calling the shots here? Nobody knows. And it's just this kind of like categorical time. So like, who's in charge? Maybe dad, maybe mom, maybe the baby, maybe like we consider you nursing whether you're nursing or not. And it's just this kind of categorical idea of like what this time period is. And I love that it's 24 months, right? Because nowadays it's like, oh, it's been 3 months. You're fine. Totally get up back to normal. And I think the idea that like Hannah sat home for 2 years and you can't remarry for 2 years and like you're just not in a place to be like doing big things for 2 years after having a baby. Really, like, there's no country on earth who gives 2 years of maternity leave. But maybe that's like really what the time for recovery is, post having a baby. And that's and also like not your kid is a baby until they turn 2, which I think also really resonates. So we think of 1-year-olds as like they're not really toddlers. There's like there's like a movement now to call them like tabies, like toddler babies, because like if you think of them like toddlers, like they don't have the brain of a toddler, but they're more capable than babies, so they're toddler babies. Okay, the last thing I just want to show you is the Rambam. The Rambam here is like great, difficult, complicated. You definitely didn't want to be in the Rambam's marriage. He like suggests that there are like times where like a wife could be like whipped for like not doing the things that she supposedly owes her husband. But he has this really long entry about breastfeeding, which is like really all of this. And we're not going to read all of it, but he has some really interesting stuff. Like he actually addresses what if a woman has twins? Does she have to breastfeed both of them? And he says, no, she only has to breastfeed one of them. And then you hire someone to breastfeed the other one, which is like super interesting. We saw last week, we saw that Tosefta about how a husband can't like force his wife to nurse a second child, and similarly how like he can't like force your wife to nurse his friend's kid or something like that, and she can't bring a second baby to nurse unless the husband agrees, and also that a wet nurse can only feed one baby at a time. So he has all of that also. And hang on one second. He has also that like a husband cannot he can't, like if she says I want to eat like all of this food and I want to eat all of this food, and the husband's like, no, it's not good for you, it's not good for the baby, it doesn't matter. Like so that's also really interesting. I think being right, so let's translate that, sorry, if the husband can't say to her like you can't eat too much or that food's really bad for the baby, even if he thinks you're gonna eat that food and the baby's gonna die, her own like physical pain actually takes priority. This is the first time we've like fully seen that just stated so explicitly. We saw that if they're arguing about whether to get a wet nurse or not, maybe if she wants to nurse, she's allowed to because it's her tsa'ar and it's her suffering. And here we're seeing again that idea that like the like hormones involved in breastfeeding or the experience involved in breastfeeding again is she experiences physical pain around it. The hunger for this woman, the hunger is intense. And even if maybe it's going to be bad for the baby in some way, for her to satiate her hunger, the husband's not allowed to stop her because even if they assume the baby's life is at risk, her physical pain takes priority, which is just like really kind of incredible. And then here's where I was telling you about some of this stuff earlier, that she can, right? So he omer ra'ui hu lischor uliknot shifcha v'hu omer ino ra'ui. She says he's wealthy enough to get someone to feed my baby, and he says I'm not wealthy enough. So like, who does the burden of proof rest on? Aleha viraya. She's the one who has to bring proof. The ein kan makom l'shua, and the husband doesn't have to take an oath. But you just like anyways, whatever, worth a read. We should probably stop here for today, but worth a read because it just goes through like all of these really kind of like amazing cases. And you see them they're just so like economics, money, all the stuff that in Judaism we really do recognize that marriage is actually about. Like the ketubah is not a romantic document at all. We recognize that like money issues can tear apart marriages, and that also part of marriage is protecting each other from financial hardship. And at the same time, right? So here we're seeing that breastfeeding also, it's like really just all about money in the eyes of the Rambam to a great degree. And he lays out like if it's a wealthy family, then this, and if it's a poor family, then that, which in a way that the Mishnah didn't. The Mishnah almost says it the opposite. Like the Mishnah starts out under the assumption that you're a poor family, and then, oh, by the way, if you have a servant, if you have another servant, if you have another servant. And the Rambam starts out the opposite, which is also kind of interesting. Anyways, lots of time could be spent comparing the Gemara in full to the Rambam in full here, which we do not have time for, but maybe you'll do it in your own time. So I mentioned at the beginning when we were looking at the Mishnah that there's something missing in the like, oh, but isn't there like a special relationship between a mother and the baby? And so far we really have not talked about that very much these last two classes. So next week it's all about mother-baby special bond, or like question mark thereof. We're going to look at some amazing midrashim about all kinds of different people. And it'll be like quite different from what we did today. So stay tuned, and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us, including we had some people on Facebook. So thank you to you as well. I want to tell you about, we've got a new class series coming up this Thursday with Rabbi Silber on Elijah in the Talmud. So that's exciting. And please check out all the other things we have going on at 5783.drisha.org. And we're looking forward to living with you again soon. Thank you so much. Good night.